Okay, folks, if I can have your attention, we'll get started. Welcome to Cantigny. I don't think there's a single person here that I haven't seen at least once before. But anyway, I am obligated to say and delighted to say that this is the historic home of the late Colonel Robert R. McCormick, longtime editor, owner, publisher of the Chicago Tribune, who passed away here at Cantigny in 1955 after running the Tribune for 40 years. He was larger than life, a philanthropist, a journalist, a businessman, a politician, all those things. But what he was proudest of in his life was his service as a soldier in the 1st Division of the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I. He named this place Cantigny in honor of the little village in France where America fought its first battle in World War I. And he was a member of the American Legion, the Society of the 1st Division. He was devoted to veterans. And when he passed away, he left his estate as a park for the people of Illinois. And that's why there's a 1st Division museum at Cantigny Park, a legacy of the Colonel's generosity and his and I think all of you know that we're part of the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, which is a major philanthropy here in the Chicagoland area. So anyway, we're delighted to have you here. Thank you for coming. This is going to be a great talk, and it's on a perfectly appropriate night. Professor Roberts is going to talk about gender relationships of the American Army in France during World War II. I'm sure it will be fascinating, and she is a delightful person and speaker, so you can look forward to that. Some of you may have heard on the news today that the Secretary of Defense announced that women will be admitted into the combat branches of all of the military services on an equal basis with men. And so that you can applaud, that's perfectly fine. And I think it's that has been a controversial issue for a very, very long time, but it is an interesting evolution in the army of a democracy that eventually evolves in the direction of the society that it serves. And so I think it's particularly appropriate that that decision was made on a night that we're addressing a similar subject from a historical point of view. So we're delighted to welcome tonight Professor Mary Lou Roberts. She is a distinguished Lucy Albrecht professor, and I'll forgive me for the pronunciation, and Plenaire Bascom professor of history at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She has a distinguished career and record of scholarship and teaching. She holds a PhD from Brown University. This is not her second book, but it's her second book on the American Army in World War II in Europe. Her first book, actually these two came out at about the same time, I see, D-Day Through French Eyes, Memoirs of Normandy, 1944. The book that she's going to talk about tonight is What Soldiers Do, Sex in the American GI in World War II France, 1944 to 1946. A subject, of course, all of you know, the 1st Infantry Division was very much in Europe and in France in 1944, at least in 1944. She has this book that came out in 2014 that she will talk about tonight has won two very prestigious prizes: the George Louis Beer Prize in International History from the American Historical Association in 2014, and the Gilbert Chenard Prize from the Society for French Historical Studies and the Institut Français d'Amérique for What Soldiers Do in 2014 as well. So it is a great pleasure to welcome a distinguished scholar to our podium tonight, Mary Louise Roberts.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'm a big fan of the big red one. How many of you are veterans of the 1st Division? That is so cool. I'm honored to be here in your presence. So I'm going to talk a little bit, and then I'll be really happy to answer any questions you may have, okay? Before starting, I just want to thank Paul and JD, who I can't seem to find right now. Maybe he left. He's so exhausted from the tour he gave me, he went home. And Paul took me out to the storage room so I could see the carrier. I learned so much from both of them, and I'm so appreciative of them allowing me to be here with you tonight. So I'm going to talk about what soldiers do, and I'm going to start with the response to the book, which was what one could call controversial. And given that I'm a French historian, a sort of small-time academic, the controversy surrounding my book was very surprising to me. On the one hand, I found myself talking to Robert Siegel on NPR, and I was on 2 television shows. That was very exciting. David Martin on NBC Sunday Morning. And also Jenny Schlesser of the New York Times did a feature story on my book. The same day that that was published, I received an email which told me to shove the book up my ass sideways, okay? And this was just the first of many, I have to say, condemning me as a Nazi feminist. And then I was called both a prude and a whore, which I thought was interesting, okay? You may wonder, what's this book about? Anyways, what I want to do today is talk about that, clarify my message, and why I wrote it. And then I want to offer my explanation for why it received what it really was, a truly schizophrenic response. On the one hand, great praise, criticism, prizes. By the way, everyone thought it was very funny that I won the beer prize from the AHA because I'm from Wisconsin. But on the other hand, some very negative comments. I think the story is worth exploring because it can tell us something about how we think about the military, and in particular the military and sex, which was the subject of the book. So first of all, what was I doing and what soldiers do? The project started, and I'll just show you the book. This is shameless advertising. It is on sale. This project started when I started reading Stars and Stripes from the summer of 1944. So I'm a French historian by training, and I started out just being interested on what were the American views of the French, what were the French views of the Americans. And this turned out to be an amazing source. And you can see Andy Rooney there. That is Andy Rooney on the left. He was a reporter for the Stars and Stripes during the war. And his memoir, by the way, My War, is, I think, my favorite memoir. I really recommend it to all of you. So the GIs read Stars and Stripes really very, very carefully. They shared it if they only had one copy. Of course, it still exists today. I'm sure people in this room have read it. What I noticed as I began to read the paper was that first of all, that Stars and Stripes was also a propaganda tool. It had a lot of sports, it had a lot of comics, and then it had these editorials which had photos in them, and I'll show you a few of them in a minute. And it occurred to me that the paper was selling the French campaign with sex, okay? And in particular, one photo kept repeating itself again and again. And I came to call this the GI photo. It's probably familiar to you. An ecstatic American GI surrounded by adoring women. I'll give you some more examples. There's another one and another one. Everyone's getting kisses in Paris. And there's another one. So I think actually, if this is familiar to you, it's because I think it's become a kind of iconic photo in the same way that, the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima has become, there we go, has become iconic for the Pacific theater. The GI photo, the soldier that gets rewarded with kisses has become, I think, the iconic good war image in Europe. Now, I can't speak about my whole book tonight because obviously too much, so I'm going to spend a little time on this GI photo just to give you some idea of what my method is and how I found this to be about sex. So my big argument in the book is that sex was really fundamental to how the war was framed, how the war was fought, and how the war was won. And I think we often think of sex as something that soldiers do. It's a recreation, it's a pastime, and I would not deny, of course, that that's true. But what I was finding is that, many military historians kind of poo-poo sex. It's sort of something they do on the off time. And what I was finding actually was that it was much more central to how the war was sold and the war was fought. And really, power relations between the French and the Americans were very much about sexual issues, prostitution, rape, and so on and so forth. So my argument is that sex is not peripheral. In fact, it's very central to the war. And that historians like Stephen Ambrose, who talk about it only as sort of a recreation, the girls, are sort of missing the point in some ways. So what I want to do tonight is show you not only that sex is central, but that it's profoundly political. It becomes very political at this time. And the GI photo is one example of that. Okay, so let's get started. Again, the impact of Stars and Stripes as an instrument of propaganda cannot be overestimated. And if you read it, as I did, it becomes obvious to you that the invasion was being portrayed in sort of mythic sexual terms, and you just saw an example of that. And here's another example. This is the kind of editorial I was talking about. And it's funny because Andy Rooney said at the time when he was editor, he didn't really think it was propaganda. But then when he went back and looked at it many, many years later when he was writing My War, he realized it was propaganda. He just didn't see it at the time. So in this picture, you have, here's what we're fighting for. And the American objectives in Europe are presented not to get rid of the Nazis or not to free Europe, but in fact to make women happy. And so here's what we're fighting for. We're going to put adoring smiles on French women's faces. And American objectives are envisioned in really sexual terms as the effort to make the women love us. The GIs would land on the shores of France, and like knights in charming armor, they would rescue women from the jaws of Nazism, and the knight was then duly rewarded with kisses. And let me just give you some other example. There's another one here. And this is pretty typical in that, that France is always represented by a female. Okay, and in fact, the roots of that are American, and it has to do with pinups. Okay, so this is another one of the editorials about cheesecake, and it shows the way in which the Americans had already made their war aims about women, about sex, about pinups. And they were, of course, very common on planes and tent walls. And some historians have said that in some ways they came to represent America, right? That we have the best cheesecake in the world. We make good tanks, we make good airplanes, but we also make great cheesecake. So in this way, thinking about France as a woman, it was already in some ways grounded in the notion of thinking of the United States as a sexy woman with great gams. So in the same way that the pinup operated in the United States, equating war aims with protecting these gorgeous women, French women came to represent France. Now, in doing this, I think Stars and Stripes did three things. First, it played on a French stereotype. Second, it solved several military problems, and I'll talk about that. And third, it simplified a military situation. So I'm going to deal with each of those in turn. So the first one was playing on a French stereotype. Now, the stereotype, and I think it still exists today, is that the French are a sexy people. Right? I have a cartoon on my door at the University of Wisconsin that has a father and a young boy, a son, looking at a nude painting. And the father turns to the son and says, "Don't worry, honey, she's not naked, she's French. Okay, so I think even now we have that stereotype of the French as a sexy people. And this is a cartoon from Stars and Stripes, and if you look at it really carefully, it plays on the same stereotype. It's a cartoon by the great cartoonist Bill Maudlin, and he's a soldier in a French town proclaiming, "This is the town my pappy told me about." So obviously Dad had been there and basically had impregnated every woman in town. So they all looked like the young American coming back to that town. So again, this notion that the French are there and willing to take on the great challenge of young men. According to one Life journalist in 1944, the general opinion along the line was that France, and I quote, was a tremendous brothel inhabited by 40 million hedonists who spend all their time eating, drinking, and making love. So that's the stereotype that I think this GI photo was playing on. Second, they were solving two military problems with the photo. The first is that the French really, the GIs had no emotional attachment to the French whatsoever. They did have some emotional attachment to the Italians because there were so many Italian Americans in the United States Army. But with France, really not at all. In some ways, and this is, the French become very painfully aware of this, that the GIs are more attached to the Germans than they are to the French. This, in some way, solved the military problem of trying to motivate the GIs to fight, right? If you're going to land on a beach that's raining down fire on you, it would be really nice to know something is waiting on the other end of the gun, and that would be a French woman. Second, I think the GI photo shored up what I call a weary manhood. The 1st Division was not unlike many other divisions in that when they landed on France, they'd already been fighting for years, right? North Africa, Sicily, in some cases, Italy, the mainland Italy, not the 1st Division. So these are very well-trained soldiers, but also sort of war-weary soldiers. And there's something about the GI photo getting to be the knight in shining armor, getting to rescue someone, which shores up the manliness of these men. They get to be heroic men. They get to be knights. They get to be rescuers. So that's, I think, the second problem. It gives men a nice role to play in which they actually feel manly and virile and powerful. And finally, there's a third problem, actually, and that is that one of the things that starts to happen during the war is the United States military begins to realize that the United States is going to take on a global war, a global position. This is the pivotal moment when the United States is moving from an isolationist country to a country that's going to have global power. And one of the things the United States Army wants to do in Europe is to prepare its soldiers for this kind of global stewardship. Okay, and we'll see in a few minutes with another one of the cartoons how making them feel manly, making them feel like they're going to be welcomed in France is part of this transition for the United States to begin to become global stewards of Europe. Those are the military problems, and it also simplified a military situation. It's pretty clear now that although France never actually although the United States never occupied France, they did use France. They took advantage of France economically, and socially, politically, in every way. When the D-Day events were about to happen, only at the last minute was the recognized French leader, Charles de Gaulle, told. Charles de Gaulle basically went to France and took power illegally. He was never given power by the Allies, and the United States did not recognize his government until October 1944, so 4 months after the invasion. And in the meanwhile, Eisenhower and Churchill did have what's called the Amgot Plan, which was a plan to actually occupy and govern France. And that basically petered out over the summer, but the French knew about it. So at the moment that this is happening, the U.S. military is, in fact, has quite unclear relationships with France in terms of power, right? Who's going to rule France? Okay, so in some ways, to simplify the operation as a great chance for guys to meet girls also simplifies for the GIs the very complex geopolitical situation that's going on, the ambiguity about French power, and really the ambiguity about French sovereignty at this point, whether it's going to be an independent state. So that's the military situation which the GI photo simplifies. So let me just now give you a few examples of how that works. Okay. So first of all, when France arrives, the war is presented as really an opportunity for guys to meet gals. And I'm just showing you this picture, Save Jitterbug, mademoiselle. So there are many pictures like this in Stars and Stripes of GIs dancing with French women, teaching them American dances, and so on and so forth. And here's another one. There we go. This is called France Gay Paris Welcomes Yanks and How. And again, women are representing France. French men are never to be found in Stars and Stripes. And the caption was, "Laughter and kisses, flowers and wine welcome the small contingent of American troops who entered Paris yesterday morning. 3 GIs newly arrived in the French capital cement Franco-American relations atop a tank." So what I find interesting there is that Franco-American relations are being cemented on a tank between beautiful women and GIs. That's what I mean about simplifying the complex military situation. Now, there are many varieties, as you can see already, of the picture, but in general, there are 2 visual elements that were constant. And the first of these is that France is always pictured as a woman, and the United States is always pictured as men. Okay? And the visual effect of that is, in fact, partly demographic realities. By 1944, there were, in fact, very few young men in France for a variety of reasons. Many of them had left in 43, 44 to join the resistance. Many of them were fighting with the Free French, either in North Africa or Italy or France, or they had joined the United States Army. And many of them were in hiding because by 1944, if the Germans saw any able-bodied young man, most likely he would be sent off to some kind of German work camp or slave labor camp. And there were many Frenchmen already in such camps. So in fact, there were very few men in France at this time. But the prevalence of women in the photo, I think, has an important symbolic effect, which is they portray France as a nation of subservient women who welcome the Americans and are very happy about it. Again, simplifying a more complex military situation. And second, the second visual constant is that the American incursion onto French soil is always envisioned in sexualized terms, as it is here. And Paris itself was eroticized in Stars and Stripes. An article likened the city, and I quote, "to a woman to give men affection and love," and urged the reader, take a good look at her. No matter what the Germans have done, she'll be worth looking at. That's Paris, the city, right? So even the French one of my favorite features of Stars and Stripe is it was teach the GIs every day a little bit of German or French, supposedly so they could communicate with the civilians better. But the difference between the German they taught the GIs and the French they taught the GIs was very different, and I think telling. So German phrases they were above the masthead of the Stars and Stripes. German phrases to be learned by GIs included keine Zigaretten, no cigarettes, Waffen niederlegen, throw down your arms, and antreten, forwards, line up forward. By contrast, the French was considered crucial to know were vous êtes très jolie, you are very pretty. Vous avez les yeux charmants, you have charming eyes. Je suis un général, I am a general. Je ne suis pas marié, I am not married. And my personal favorite, vos parents sont-ils chez eux, which means your parents, are they at home? So, in all these ways, right, France gets eroticized. And what's even more interesting is if you look at French newspapers, which start to come out at the end of August, the Parisian papers, about, I think it's 10 papers, sort of resuscitate themselves to give coverage of the liberation. And their coverage of the liberation is quite different from the American version. So I'll just show you a couple of examples. Okay, so here you have, this is in a French paper called Franc-Tireur, and it's, here the liberators are clearly French, okay, not American. And this is very typical. All the soldiers on trucks, on tanks, always in French papers are French men, okay? And in all the 12 dailies, is what I looked at, there was one photograph of a French woman kissing an unmistakably American soldier. One, okay, and 12 dailies over a month's time. In all other instances, it was Frenchmen who were in fact enjoying the now famous French embrace. So the difference, I think, is quite striking. Here's another one. Okay, this is an interesting one also to contrast. Again, you have here both French and Americans. So this is Americans in the picture. But look at how different it is. The French and the Americans are standing side by side. They're comrades, right? One isn't kissing the other. They're equals sharing a victory. And in some ways, the French are not looking like they need to be rescued, right? They're right in there with it. So you have a very different picture when you look at the French side of things. And the most different thing of all is that French men are present. Okay, and in fact, it is true that Paris liberated itself, obviously without the Allies, but the actual liberation of Paris was by the French resistance, and then what were called the Boys of Leclerc, which was the French army. So in fact, there were a lot of French men in Paris, both in the army and in the resistance. What's interesting is that when you see French men in Stars and Stripes, they are always denigrated, okay? And of course, this is because the American men need to rule out and conquer their only competition, right, which is French men. So I only have time to give you one example. This is a really interesting cartoon. But it gives you an idea of how Frenchmen are portrayed. You have on the right side a resistance fighter. He's got the classic French beret on. And by the way, I don't know, I'm sure you know this, but in fact, the resistance was very powerful in the north of France during that summer, and Eisenhower once compared them to 15 divisions. So even though I think we still don't recognize the French resistance as having played a strong role, Eisenhower did. Now, this Frenchman has plenty of ammunition. He has sharp knives, he has guns, he has a cache of bullets, but somehow none of it adds up to manliness. He's really a kind of a buffoonish figure and feminine. And the equation of a gun with one's manhood is explicit in this cartoon because if you look carefully, there is a condom wrapped around the driver's gun muzzle. So actually, I could use a pointer for this. Right there, okay? Now, the reason for that is that the GIs would use condoms. They did receive condoms, I think it was 5 a month, to keep their guns clean. That's what they were doing here. But given everything that's going on here, what's happening is manliness gets rationed to American men, but not French men, to eliminate the competition. Okay. Now, this comes back to that notion of teaching the GIs how to be political stewards, how to take on this new, more global role. Because, in fact, Frenchmen are portrayed as obviously unable to take care of their own country. Okay, they're frequently portrayed as cuckolded, first by the Germans, then by the Americans, and they're also portrayed as non-men, as very feminine men. So let's look at this one. So here is where I really see the stewardship role happening. This picture is a crystal ball. Look into it and you see a vision of tomorrow. You see the world coming to America for help and leadership. The worried, pleading, hopeful look in this old man's eyes will be in the eyes of the world, right? This is global stewardship. The question on his lips will be on the world's lips. What shall we do? Where can I get food? Where can I work? These are the big questions. We can't duck them. All we know is this, that America is you and me and the folks back home, and that the world trusts us, respects us, and is looking to us for signals. So here you have a real, again, denigration of the French man. He's an old man, right? Old Europe can't take care of itself anymore. The once mighty but now prostrated European patriarch needs to be helped by the young American GIs, the true men in this picture. So what I do in chapter 2 of my book, this is the sort of method, is to try and look at the ways in which how by sexually mythologizing the mission into a kind of heterosexual romance, what Stars and Stripes does is to simplify the complexity of the military situation into a kind of heterosexual opportunity, and also prepare the GIs for global stewardship by denigrating French masculinity. And again, my big argument here is that sex is central. This is not something that's peripheral. This is central to the conception of the American mission in Europe. Okay, so now I'm just going to briefly tell you about the rest of my book. I'm just going to go over that, and then I'll be happy to answer questions. So again, as my research started to develop, I realized that sex was not only the way we framed the mission, but that the management of sex in the European theater became a primary problem. Because, of course, what happened was the GIs got to France. They knew it was a so-called brothel with 40 million hedonists. And for various reasons, including Stars and Stripes propaganda, they got there and they wanted to have sex. And a lot of it, okay? What I call a tsunami of male lust. So there was a lot of romance and there was a lot of prostitution, okay? And there was, as a result, venereal disease, large amounts of venereal disease. I was talking about this with JD. Penicillin starting a little bit to be used by the summer and fall of 1944, but is not really in mass use until December. So venereal disease could take a man off the line for many weeks before penicillin. So this was a primary problem. And the other problem, of course, is prostitution. Because it's prostitutes who have venereal disease. Now, by the late fall, Eisenhower was receiving news of venereal disease, and he was also had in his hands, I literally found this in the National Archives, a paper that claimed, it was the Cherbourg paper, that claimed that women were afraid to go out in the streets, and, quote, there is terror in the streets, and even the security of the home is imperiled. So I was not the first person to know that sexual promiscuity and sexual violence, rape, has been going on in Normandy that summer. But I was the first historian to do two things. And I'm just going to explain that to me because I first saw what was going on in Normandy in terms of prostitution, in terms of rape, in a little town called Le Havre, which actually was the gateway to the European theater for like 1.5 million Americans. And what I did was I used the French documents, okay? No American historian has ever gone to Le Havre and looked at the French documents for a couple of reasons. One, most American historians don't speak French and they don't know the French archive system. And I was trained as a French historian, not an American historian, so I look at French sources. I wasn't the first one to think this up, but I was the first one to think about maybe looking at French sources. And as I sat in this tiny room in the local archives in Le Havre, truly a small municipal archive, I just really couldn't believe what I was reading. I'll show you an example. This is a letter to the mayor, Pierre Voisin, of the town of Le Havre. And he, like many of the people in Le Havre, was truly outraged. And I'll just quote to you from a translated version of the French. Attacked, robbed, run over, both on the streets and in our houses. This is a regime of terror imposed by bandits in uniform. And the police blotter of the daily local Le Havre paper actually bore out this gentleman's complaint. The police blotter showed thefts, traffic accidents, the jeeps driving too quickly down the small French streets, and fights, prostitution, and rape. Really shocking to me, as well as I'm sure to you. So I started then to go look at other small places, Saint-Lô, Cherbourg, Reims, Paris, and I saw that violence was a major problem wherever Americans were present. It was not a problem in Caen, which was, of course, the British area of deployment and fighting. Nor was, so when I got to Paris, I thought, well, this is going to be the true test, because Canadians, British, and Americans were there. I looked at a file this big in the police department about problems with Americans, and I think there were 3 British and 2 Canadian cases. Okay, so clearly the Americans were the ones who were causing trouble. And so looking at these documents allowed me to see D-Day through French eyes. And it was a different picture than I had seen. I come from a very patriotic family, very proud family. My father did serve in the Second World War. So that's one thing I did that I think gave me a different story of D-Day. The other is, because I'm a gender historian by training, I take sex seriously as a form of power. Okay, that's what gender historians learn, that it's a form of dominance. To sexually own a person as a GI owns a prostitute is, in fact, to manipulate her body for his own personal pleasure. That's really quite an intimate form of power. And one of the things I argue in the book is that from that relationship, again, the GI learned to have power over the French people and also, again, learned to become global leaders, okay, who expected, at the most intimate level, subservience from the French people. I'll just give you one example that I thought was particularly interesting. I looked at the diary of Chester Hansen, who was the military aide to Omar Bradley in Normandy. And in his diary on the 18th of September, he said that he had been in Paris and he had encountered very aggressive prostitutes. One of them came up to him and said, "You will sleep with me tonight, won't you?" And he said, "No, I will not." And then he says in his diary, "French people have sold themselves to no one and no one is impressed by them," which was in fact a common view. But what was interesting to me is that he conflated a sexual proposition with a more general bid for French recognition, right? French people have sold themselves to no one and no one is impressed with them. So to me, it began to think that maybe this whole prostitution thing was having a bigger effect on not only French reputation, but the GI belief that they could sell and buy the French people and have great power over them. And so Hansen, his rejection of the prostitute and his rejection of the French generally go hand in hand. And I will have to say that whether for good or bad, the GIs had more interaction with prostitutes than they did with French statesmen, or really any other kind of Frenchmen, except perhaps resistance members. So at the intimate level there, I think there's the way in which sex is operating as a form of power. But at the broader level, at the sort of macro level, there are bitter conflicts between the United States Army and the French government over prostitution and what to do with it. Because, in fact, as many of you are aware, prostitution was outlawed in the United States Army. This did not, however, prevent them from giving each soldier 5 condoms every time they left the base. Army officers, therefore, blame French women for the rates of venereal disease. And at the heart of the quarrel was the issue of discretion. And this took me back to Le Havre once again. So soon after D-Day, Army officers realized they could not control prostitution. And I remember one officer in particular who said, one of my favorite lines, "The sexual act cannot, unfortunately, be made unpopular." Okay? The sexual act cannot be made unpopular. And this was difficult because the War Department prohibited sexual prostitution. And so the French said to them, look, why don't you just create brothels? And we'll have doctors present. We can have the girls examined before they go to work, and we'll keep it safe, and you'll also reduce your issues of rape. And the American Army said no way, because any moment that they institutionalized prostitution would make it open to journalists and therefore open and known to the American public. And that was absolutely forbidden. They did not want the American public to know how much prostitution was going on. And the rate was as high as 80% among unmarried GIs. So instead of institutionalizing, so in fact, the mayor of Le Havre came to Colonel Weed, who was the commander there, and he said, look, we could build a little brothel right next to your barracks, which were in the northern part of the city. And that way, the GIs wouldn't have to come down into the city, and, we could keep it medically safe. And this was great for the mayor of Le Havre, because then he wouldn't have horny GIs wandering around his town, and particularly on the way out of the European theater. The summer of 1945, there was enormous amounts of alcohol use. We had a lot of traumatized soldiers who had been through a lot, and they were on their way home. Some of the discipline had been lost. There was a real problem in the town. And so the idea was to keep them out of the town. So what they would do, literally, is they would go and they would knock on door to door and see if there was somebody there who wanted to have sex. Sometimes they would be drunk enough that they'd break through doors and so on and so forth. So what happened was Weed, the colonel, refused. He didn't want to have any institutionalization of prostitution. So it was absolutely impossible for the good citizens of Le Havre to go for a walk, to go visit their mother's grave, to go to the park without seeing a soldier and a prostitute having sex. There was literally not enough hotel rooms in this small town, and abandoned buildings was another very, very common spot. So, and this is happening in broad daylight and in the presence of children. And so this was, I think, ironic, because what had to remain discreet from the American people became extremely visual and extremely visible to the French people, okay? And they found it very offensive, not only because it was hard for their children to watch, but also they felt it was a fundamental lack of respect for their presence as citizens of a nation. So that's what the second part of my book is about. And then I'm just going to briefly tell you a little bit about the third part, which is about rape. Now, there were rapes. There were quite a few. What I did was I went and found the judge's reviewed all the cases, found the rape cases, and then ordered the court-martial trial records for those. So this was about 2 years of research that I did. And unfortunately, I found some really disturbing things about not only the rape of women, but the trials of men. First of all, the American government, the War Department, was very disturbed by how much rape was happening. And again, when Eisenhower got this newspaper saying terror on the streets, he was really quite concerned. So what the American military did was, in fact, to scapegoat the problem as an African-American problem. And I go into great detail in the book about why African Americans could be more easily accused of rape. Partly it was because they were in service sectors, in port towns, unloading boats. So they had much more contact with the civilian population. They could also be prosecuted more easily by a court-martial because they were not mobile. Right? They were stationary. I mean, a GI who was on the run, particularly in the late summer of 1944, when there was a rape wave, he could rape a woman and be on his way the next day, never get caught. Okay? So this is what happened, that it wasn't an American crime, it was an African-American crime. Okay? It became that by the fall, really by September of 1944. And the other disturbing thing I found is that many of these gentlemen, and I actually found this by looking at the French archive, and I found it, I would keep getting letters that said, such and such person is going to be executed in the town that the rape occurred. And literally the army would write to the mayors of these small towns and say the execution will be on such and such a day at such and such an hour. And in that way, 27 African-American soldiers were hung by rope and executed. And in the land of the guillotine, they couldn't find a hangman. And so I literally found a file on this. They imported a hangman from Texas to do the job. So what I began to realize is that a lot of the Jim Crow violence that we experienced during a lot of lynching, essentially, right, was in fact the long arm of Jim Crow had reached Europe. Now, in rape, I think you see how more than ever sex acts as a form of dominance, right, as a form of power. You take someone's, body and you do what you want with it without their permission. And rape was actually the most common crime in the European theater and in the Second World War. Of course, the Southeast Asians had this phenomenon of the comfort woman and so on and so forth. But again, we don't talk about rape in war. War always entails rape, but we don't really talk about it. And one of the things that happened when my book came out was people were shocked that it happened even in Normandy, even by the Americans. So what I want to do is end again coming back to the controversy of my book and explain, given this, why I think it was controversial. I think rape's silence in the historical record of the Second World War comes from an unwritten rule of war. An unwritten rule of war which is nevertheless very powerful, which is the belief that men in battle have a really extraordinary need for sex and often feel, not always, but often feel entitled to get sex. So rape is used as a symbol of conquest, right? The thousands of women that were raped in Berlin in April 1945. And rape is also used as a symbol of defeat. Look at the Russian front in 1941, where the Wehrmacht raped women with utter impunity. They were not in any way prosecuted. So rape is always part of this dominance and a symbol of both defeat and victory. So let's return to the controversy surrounding my book. A Korean veteran, I learned so much from the letters that I received, and I did try to return them all. A Korean veteran wrote me, "When you have survived living what might be the last day of your life, then and only then can you question the morality of soldiers." So in this man's mind, I was a woman who had no right to judge those who have experienced war firsthand. And for him, sex was an erotic release, a just payment for sacrifice in combat, a reward for survival, but not an instrument of domination. So herein lies the explanation, I think, for my book's controversy. We have trouble understanding sex as a form of power and rape as a weapon of power in war. And my purpose in writing the book was not to criticize the moral failings of the greatest generation, who included my beloved parents, nor to hold them to a higher standard of behavior than, say, the Russians or the Japanese. And obviously, there's no comparing the amount of rape that happened in Normandy with the amount of rape that happened, as I said, on the Russian front or in Berlin. We're talking about hundreds in Normandy and thousands in those other two cases. But I did want to open our eyes to the ways in which sex is used as a weapon of warfare and as a form of dominance. But that point seems to have gone missing in my readership. And so I become, a Nazi feminist and a bit of a prude and a whiner about the behavior of the American GIs, all things that were said about me. But that dismissal of sexual so-called shenanigans, that boys will be boys attitude, is unacceptable to me, not only as a feminist, but as an historian. Because as an historian, I seek to understand past events as products of circumstances, rather than unwritten rules of war or inevitable results of biological needs. And as a feminist, I view such an approach as coming too close to excusing the sexual violence such erotic desire might produce. I'm dedicated to writing new histories of war, which take sexual relations seriously as a form of dominance, and which chart the American rise to global power as happening in the bedroom, as well as the planning room, the brothel, as well as the battlefield. So I want to end with one image, a very famous image again. The photo is again iconic. The time is August 1945. The place is Times Square in New York. A great moment in American history, VJ Day. A sailor capitalizes on the giddy moment of victory, grabs a nurse, takes her into his arms, and plants a big kiss on her lips. And the great photographer Alfred Eisenstadt is standing nearby, and he captures the moment. As we have learned, conquest has been eroticized throughout the war. The gorgeous gams of pinup girls grace the sides of bombers. The liberation of Europe is defined as a French kiss. And now, in America's very greatest hour, the notorious kiss has come home to Times Square, imported by a sailor, and I think domesticated or made a little safer by the fact that she's a nurse, an American nurse. Sex and romance stood at the center of how the war was framed, and I think this photo made it vital to how the war was won. Thank you.
Okay, so we will be taking questions. So we have up front over here.
Your talk brings up so many thoughts to my mind. One of them, first of all, as far as nurses, let me tell you, as a nurse, nurses have a reputation for being fast and loose, and I think only now dental hygienists have taken us over, but they have been. And I think one thing about you take into nationalism, where Americans didn't want to see their boys as going out being interested in sex like that. We never showed any dead American bodies in any pictures. They were always the enemy. And if you look at France, the way that they surrendered so quickly to Germany really surprised and shocked everybody. And I think the thought of the representation of France and how low they were, there was certainly a lot of question about France, and they went down in everybody's esteem, and who knows what was going to go on. I mean, there were so many factors in why France went down like that anyhow, including the strength of the German army and World War I, but that was a big issue, and the fact that Vichy, Vichy, and de Gaulle, his personality was very negative. I know FDR hated him, and he was the only person who was standing up really for France, and there was really nobody else, but there was so much suspicion on the other people, and the resistance. There are all those socialists too, and so many issues with that. That to me it sounds like Stars and Stripes, and the idea they really did a good job on their selling with that, and it's really sad that sex becomes such a thing. In a way, I can understand wanting a sexual release, and they are, well, the French weren't the enemy, the Germans were, but it's just really sad to see that happened. And unfortunately, with the newspapers and the press, that they were concerned then if the press got hold of any army-arranged prostitution, how that would certainly not go over with the mothers and fathers back home. I can't imagine today, but in the Civil War, the Union Army had a plan. Actually, in Nashville, they did have an army-run prostitution where the army doctors, they would have prostitution houses set up basically by the army, the Union Army, and the doctors would check the girls and so that they were safe. And unfortunately, okay, I'm sorry. This just really brings a lot to me. So I was just wondering your thought on American and everybody else's view of France, if that had anything to do with it also. Like, I think it does too, that we had to make such a big effort.
Yeah, I think that there was not, for whatever, the issues are too complex to go into, but for whatever reason, the Americans had to be convinced to liberate France. Okay, so I think that caused this, using of the French stereotype, because there was collaboration. You're right; they didn't like de Gaulle. So they needed to create a campaign that would work. And I think the rescue mission of French women was what did it.
Right back here.
Doctor, good evening. Appreciate you coming here, and it's a pleasure. I kind of refute what your presentation was, and I did want to ask you a couple of questions. One about the idea of you've made such a position about the women being utilized in Stars and Stripes. Historically, and you would know this better than I do, I think the image of the French Republic has always been of a woman, of a mother wanting to take care of her children. And I would ask that Stars and Stripes were putting that out. The other thing about the French resistance in Paris would be my second question. The fact that the resistance did, in fact, open up Paris, but that was contingent upon the Germans pulling out and the Americans on their way in. So I would ask you to comment about the historical significance of women in France, and then secondly about the fact that you had the liberation going.
Well, I think I'll do the resistance one first. I think I said, of course, the Allies made possible the liberation of France just by their eastward moment. But directly, Paris was liberated by itself. But obviously, without the Allies surrounding France, that was not going to happen. And it was something which Eisenhower let happen. He said, this is important for the French to liberate their own city. So clearly, I think I said, the Allies obviously were the ones that motivated that. But the city itself, and that's important to my argument because that meant that the city was liberated by French men, none of whom were in any way in Stars and Stripes. So that's the only reason I brought that up. And yes, you're right. It's the symbol of France is Marianne, and she's not a maternal figure at all. She's this gorgeous booby, figure. And every 20 years, the French have a new model. And so I think it was, who was that sexy? Claudine Colbert, I think, was one. So these are. But I don't think that entered at all into Stars and Stripes. For one thing, it's not that well known. Like Germany has Germania, England has the Queen. Everyone has a female image in Western Europe for their country. So I don't think that made a difference, either because the Americans don't know about it or because it's not that different from any other European iconography of nation.
The police town logs that British and other forces were getting in a lot less trouble than Americans. Was there some thing in the British Army that they were not as sexually active or in as many of these rapes? Or was there some other factor that caused them to seem to have behaved better than the Americans?
Yeah, I don't really know. I've talked to a lot of British historians about that. And what they've told me, I'll just pass on, but it's pure speculation, is that the British don't have the same myth about France as sexy, okay? And in fact, they think about the French women as kind of trashy, okay? So there wasn't this erotic pull, in the same way. But I have not looked at, the Stars and Stripes of England. It's a great question, but all the British people say, oh, they didn't really want French girls. They think they're all whores.
So we've got a question.
So I don't think
here.
they were better behaved. I think they were less interested.
Here we go.
A couple of comments. I think as far as the liberation of Paris was concerned, that a German general by the name of von Paulus had the most to do with that. And also, I think in view of what happened historically to France in World War I and World War II, that in the unlikely event that the Germans ever march on France again, this time we ought to tell them they have to keep it. Oh, okay. All right. Sorry. Okay. All right. That German general that said, we're not going to fight. We're just going to abandon the city.
I don't think I can answer that question.
Anyone over here? One sec, Tim.
You mentioned that some individuals were hanged for rape. And what was that again?
African Americans were accused of rape, and then they were put on trial. I read the court-martial trial records, and they were accused at a higher rate than white soldiers, and they were also found guilty and executed at a higher rate than white soldiers.
Were white soldiers hung also?
Very few, maybe one or two.
1 or 2 versus 26.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome to Illinois. My question, being a historian myself, how hard was it for you to read Stars and Stripes as an academic versus Stars and Stripes as a line-serving soldier who'd be attracted to the female image and who would be drawn into wanting actually to read the message versus someone who is sitting in 2014 in Madison, Wisconsin with somewhat of an agenda to populate?
Okay, so first of all, I really enjoyed reading Stars and Stripes. It wasn't, a critical academic endeavor. I had many talks with my father about the sports because I'd never heard of a team called the Browns before, for one thing. My father and I are both very devoted Red Sox fans, and it was very sad because the Red Sox almost won that year in '44, and then they didn't, and obviously they weren't going to win for many more years. So it wasn't a completely academic thing for me, and I did try to put myself in the place of an American soldier. And what struck me in that sense is that the American soldier was extremely homesick. That what he wanted to read was Peanuts, or Beetle Bailey or sports, or and he wanted to look at beautiful women, all that stuff. So I don't think I was completely averse to that. But on the other hand, obviously I'm not a soldier. I'm never going to be able to read it as a soldier. But that doesn't mean I can't read it and try to understand it as an historical source in some way, it seems to me.
Anyone else?
Time for one more. I think David, well, there's a gentleman here who has a question, and he'll take priority. He hasn't had a question yet.
Maybe a little bit sidetracked, but what was do you know any idea what the venereal disease rate was in the U.S. Army in Europe at that time?
I'm having trouble understanding you. I'm sorry.
Do you have any idea what the rate of venereal disease was in the U.S. Army in Europe at that time in 44?
I don't have the statistics with me right here, but it was pretty high. I think it was like almost 10% of the soldiers have venereal disease, and maybe 10 or 11%, which is considered to be extremely unacceptable.
Yeah. From what I understood also, second question, is that, or maybe just a statement, wasn't a soldier, if he caught venereal disease, was he given an Article 15 also? Does that show up in any records that you saw?
Okay, the soldier who caught venereal disease, what was the second half of the question? Sorry. I think you're just talking too fast. Sorry, if you could talk a little slower.
From what I understand in some of my readings is that if a soldier caught venereal disease, he was given what we call an Article 15, which is like a non-judicial punishment. At that time. Did you find that also in your research?
Okay, so actually at the beginning of the war, there was punishment for getting a venereal disease. And then they found that because there was a punishment, the soldiers were not fessing up to the fact that they had venereal disease. And this became particularly problematic for pilots who were taking certain kinds of drugs to deal with the symptoms of it without getting any kind of medical attention. And then they were going on long missions on these drugs, which was very dangerous for everybody. And so that led the War Department to change its policy to not punish in any way the reporting of venereal disease. Just to, they found it was creating further problems because not only were they continuing to infect other people, but they were oftentimes taking certain drugs, which was dangerous to the mission of the war. Does that answer your question? Okay, yeah.
Okay, terrific. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thanks very much. I'm very sympathetic to your question. It made me think about a lot of different things, too, in ways that I never have, because I'm a pretty traditional military historian. Good guys over there, bad guys over here. These people went around that way. So this is a very different take on it, and we appreciate very much your work and your presentation. This is it for 2015, right? This is our last program. Some of you have come to almost every one of these, so we very much thank you for that. We're going to have another set of programs, of course, in 2016. Things aren't done here at Cantigny or at the 1st Division Museum. I think the next big thing that we've got is the Lego show on December 12th and 13th. And that will be here, of course. It's very, very popular. Last year, we did the Battle of the Bulge and Legos at the 1st Division Museum, and that was extremely popular. This year on that weekend, we have a Lego team coming in, and they're building a model in our lobby of the USS Missouri, which is the battleship where the Japanese surrender occurred at the end of World War II. It will be 17 feet long, so you got to come see that. And on that note, I would, and don't forget, please, that Tom Wills from the Cantigny Post 556 of the American Legion will gladly take donations for the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Vets in Wheaton, a great institution that's helping solve another social issue that sometimes attends military service. So I want to to thank Professor Roberts very much. If you would come back up here. We have two gifts for you. The first is every year we commission a coin for the First Division Museum. And this year we're commemorating the 50th anniversary, if you can possibly imagine that, of the American intervention in Vietnam. And so it has the logo on the back, has the Vietnam colors and a picture of a Huey in which so many First Division soldiers and other soldiers flew. Now, when we pass these coins on, you got to take it like that, right? So you have to learn how to do that.
All right, I will.
And then the other thing we have, since you've written about D-Day in Normandy so well, we commissioned this book last year by John McManus, The Dead and Those About to Die, D-Day, the Big Red One at Omaha Beach. And we'd like you to have a copy of that as well to remember Cantigny with.
Thank you.
So thank you, Lou.
Yeah.
Well done.
Yeah.
Well done. And, yes, for those of you who have purchased